CRYSTAL ROMEO is an exhibition that explores landscape and the body and the relationship between those two ideas. A key work to the exhibition is the Norman Lindsay print, which I started with, which was a silk screen of the magic pudding on top of an original Lindsay image. The original print is called Witch Mask and is a classic kind of Lindsay figurative work, which I've then placed his very infamous magic pudding face on top of. I guess Lindsay is someone that I'm looking to in all these works as a kind of access point to thinking about landscape in the context of Australia, and I guess a sort of camp lens at looking at Australian landscape, or possibly Australian landscape as a set or a constructed idea of which we pace our sort of theatrical bodies upon. Lindsay also is a really interesting figure for me because he blurs this boundary between, I guess, what we think of as a painterly history within Australia, which we form our sort of cultural foundations upon. He's a kind of embarrassing uncle of cultural history in Australia, because he's very overblown and his figures are kind of have a tipping point into a mannerist, almost caricature-like intensity, which I think is particularly interesting when you place it in an Australian context. And I think that his magic pudding figure in particular is also something that requires a little bit of contemplation and possibly re-examination. But yeah, there's something about his sort of animist figurations and his caricature, swollen figuratives that provide different access points to looking at Australian landscape. I guess when I'm looking at Norman Lindsay, I think he's a really important dissident character that was a real dissident to the modernist narrative, essentially, to the definitions that modernism espoused between body and space, and a lot of the images that we see of the kind of Heidelberg School or the Romantic period very much demarcate the land between the body and the borders which it established. It progressed the land, it pioneered the land, and there is something innately problematic in the way that it justifies a kind of white presence upon it. And Lindsay is this really queer, weird alternative to that narrative. I think he offers a kind of high camp, overblown, almost Rococo-esque treatment to that space that is unnerving and uncomfortable, and I think arguably still uncomfortable to sort of current scholarship. And why is that? Because he's a weirdo and hard to place within a lineage because of his interdisciplinary output across publishing and cartoons and literature, and also his etchings and paintings, but also because he doesn't figure in any kind of modernist narrative about futuring the landscape. In fact, he almost is retrograde in his sort of Rubenesque weirdness. And I think it's important with these foundations that we set for ourselves around the sort of, I guess, colonial body and the landscape, that there is these rupturous weirdos in there who show us that our body within this space is constructed, that the very nature of the white body in that landscape is constructed, and we use landscape to sort of co-opt towards cultural identity. And I think that in Australia in particular, we use landscape as a way to co-opt our sort of nationalist agenda. And I think Lindsay proposes something different and something more problematic and harder to define. And it's really, and you know, what travels with the sign of clarity, you know, I think to have something ambiguous and unclear and something that needs re-examination, which is definitely, I think, the weird caricature of Lindsay's work, or the kitsch ubiquity of it, means that I think he's an important figure in that lineage, and one that's, yeah, just slices a little gap in an otherwise kind of very masculine, hegemonic, dare I say, lineage of which we claim our right to be here in a way. I wanted to do a kind of bodily experience of landscape, and I created a device for shooting having a kind of romantic gaze upon the landscape, capturing light and looking to the landscape through a sort of Cartesian model of perception through the eyes, through that kind of representation, and then mash it up with more of a sort of abstract geometric way of thinking about an engagement with nature or the body. And I documented a whole lot of walks that I did from Daytona Beach or New Smyrna Beach in Florida, and then took that strategy to Lura and to the Blue Mountains, which is Lindsay made famous through his various etchings and painting works. And I wanted to draw a line of like camp landscape from Florida through to Lura. So created a kind of a moving textile of landscape, which hopefully gives a kind of bodily experience of this landscape, and in turn kind of conflates these spaces together through time, space, and place. The video is a portrait of a model friend, fellow artist called Casey Legler, who is one of the first women to be represented by Ford male models in the States. What I was interested in with Casey was the fact that she's able to perform a certain vernacular of movement, which is attributed to modelling, which is essentially the performance of consumerism, really. She can perform very aptly the tropes between masculine and feminine performance of modelling, and what she shows us through her shifting through this vernacular is the construction of that sort of gaze, or that kind of modelling to the camera in itself, or how the design behind this particular movement vernacular, which I find very interesting, because generally I'm interested in the way that movement oscillates through the body to show us different models of perception, or perhaps the fluidity of the language itself. So the Party Body Rewind dance piece is a composite body dance work that explores both the creation of two images oscillating at the one time, one being a face of a sort of tiger-esque monster, and the second is the three dancers that make up this, animate and invoke life into this beast. And sort of dramaturgically, the way that I thought about it was that the body was both to the front and to the back, so I had to think about how the body worked in a sort of 360 dimension, and how to costume and configure the body so that it could create this image that slid in and out of a sort of solid form of this animated character, which for me, I chase these images around that push into this sort of uncanny sense of perception and give us a sense of unease, because I think it alludes to a certain relationship that we have to perception that might suggest a metaphysical space that constantly intrigues me towards it, and I'm always seeking out to describe.